The sun is just lifting above the Pacific horizon. It is early 1944. Somewhere over the open ocean, a Japanese naval pilot scans his fuel gauge as carefully as the sky ahead. The needle sits lower than it should. It always does now. Every maneuver must be measured. Every climb is a calculation. Below him, the sea is empty. Ahead, the radio crackles with reports of American aircraft. Again, another wave, then another. Their engines do not hesitate. Their formations hold tight. They circle, disengage, return, and come back once more, as if fuel itself were unlimited. Japanese pilots begin to notice the pattern. The Americans never seem to ration their flight time. Their fighters escort bombers for hours. Their carriers launch aircraft morning after morning. Even after heavy losses, the sky refills with enemy planes. This is not bravado. It is not chance. It is something deeper. Something built far from the front lines, in places these pilots will never see. And to understand why American aircraft kept flying when others could not, the story must begin long before the first shots were fired. Long before American and Japanese pilots met in the skies over the Pacific, the war was already being shaped by oil. In the early 20th century, modern warfare became inseparable from fuel. Ships burned it. Aircraft depended on it. Armies moved only as far as their fuel trucks could reach. And in this new reality, the United States and Japan entered the Second World War from radically different starting positions. The United States sat atop one of the largest petroleum reserves on Earth. By 1940, America produced more than 60% of the world's oil. Vast fields in Texas, California, and Oklahoma pumped crude day and night. Refineries stretched along the Gulf Coast. Pipelines, rail networks, and ports already connected fuel to factories, airfields, and naval bases. Even before the war, the United States possessed not just oil, but the infrastructure to move at scale. Japan did not. By the late 1930s, Japan produced less than 10% of the oil it consumed. Its home islands contained no major petroleum reserves. Almost all fuel had to be imported, primarily from the United States, the Dutch East Indies, and British-controlled regions of Southeast Asia. Every barrel crossed thousands of miles of ocean in vulnerable tankers. This dependence shaped Japanese strategy. As the war in China expanded after 1937, fuel consumption soared. Aircraft flew longer missions. Warships patrolled farther from home. Stockpiles shrank faster than planners had expected. By 1940, Japan's leaders knew that oil was their greatest strategic weakness. Then came the embargo. In the summer of 1941, responding to Japan's expansion into French Indochina, the United States froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports. Overnight, Japan lost access to roughly 80% of its petroleum supply. The fuel tanks of the Imperial Navy and Army Air Force suddenly had a clock ticking above them. Japanese planners calculated that existing reserves might last 18 to 24 months under wartime conditions. After that, aircraft would be grounded. Fleets would be immobilized. The war, any war, would be over. This reality drove Japan toward a desperate gamble. If oil could no longer be purchased, it would have to be seized. The Dutch East Indies offered rich petroleum fields, but standing in the way was the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor was not just a military target. It was an attempt to buy time. Time to capture fuel sources. Time to secure supply lines. Time before the tanks ran dry. At the start of the Pacific War, in December 1941, Japanese pilots still flew with confidence. Training hours were high. Fuel was conserved but available. Aircraft carriers and land-based air units could operate at full strength for now. Early victories reinforced the belief that speed and skill could overcome material limits. The United States, meanwhile, was only beginning to mobilize. Its aircraft production was accelerating, but many units were inexperienced. Yet beneath the surface, something decisive was already underway. American war planners understood fuel not as a constraint, but as a weapon. The question was not how to conserve it, but how to deliver it everywhere, continuously, regardless of distance. This difference in thinking would widen with every passing month. As 1942 unfolded, Japan expanded rapidly across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing oil fields but struggling to move refined fuels safely back to the home islands. American submarines began to thin tanker traffic. Losses mounted quietly at first, then catastrophically. Each sinking reduced the margin Japanese pilots relied upon. And while Japanese fuel stocks slowly eroded, the United States was preparing something entirely different, an industrial and logistical response that would soon reshape the balance of the war in the air. By 1942, the United States was no longer preparing for war. It was reorganizing itself around it. American oil production did not merely increase. It surged. Wells that had supplied civilian markets were redirected toward military demand. New drilling expanded in Texas and California. Refineries ran around the clock, converting crude into high-octane aviation gasoline at a scale no other nation could approach. By 1943, the United States was producing enough fuel not only for its own forces, but for many of its allies as well. Yet oil in the ground meant nothing without delivery. The true American advantage lay in logistics. The U.S. Navy and Army built a global fuel distribution system almost from scratch. Tanker fleets multiplied rapidly, protected by escorts and improved convoy tactics. Pipelines replaced vulnerable rail routes along the American coast, reducing losses to German submarines. Floating fuel depots appeared across the Pacific. Massive storage ships anchored at forward bases, capable of refueling carriers, cruisers, and destroyers without returning to port. On newly captured islands, construction battalions, known as the Seabees, worked at relentless speed. Within weeks of landings, airstrips were carved from coral and jungle. Fuel tanks rose beside them. Pipelines snaked across beaches. Aircraft arriving at these bases did not wait for fuel shipments. They found them already there. For American pilots, fuel became invisible. Training hours expanded dramatically. Fighter pilots logged hundreds of hours before combat deployment. Carrier pilots practiced repeated takeoffs and landings, often flying multiple sorties a day. Bombers trained for long-range missions that mirrored future combat flights, burning fuel in volumes Japanese planners could not imagine sustaining. In the Pacific, distance was the enemy. American planners treated it as a problem to be engineered away. Each advance westward brought not just troops and aircraft, but entire fuel ecosystems. Tank farms followed the fleet. Refineries were improvised afloat. Even damaged ships could be refueled and returned to action with remarkable speed. Japan struggled to match this pace. While oil fields in the Dutch East Indies had been captured largely intact, refining capacity was limited. Tankers were scarce. American submarines targeted fuel ships relentlessly. By 1943, Japan was losing tankers faster than they could be replaced. Crude oil piled up in Southeast Asia, while gasoline grew scarce at frontline bases. Japanese pilots felt the effects immediately. Training hours were cut to conserve fuel. New pilots were rushed through shortened programs. Veteran airmen flew fewer practice missions. Carrier air groups, once drilled to perfection, began operating on thin margins. Meanwhile, American aircraft activity intensified. Japanese intelligence reports noted the discrepancy with growing alarm. U.S. fighters seemed to appear without pause. Bombers returned from long-range missions, refueled, and flew again. Losses did not slow the tempo. If anything, American operations grew more aggressive as the war progressed. By late 1943, Japanese commanders understood that they were not facing an opponent limited by distance or scarcity. They were facing an industrial system that treated fuel as limitless and planned accordingly. This imbalance would soon move from reports and calculations into direct, unavoidable experience. In the air, Japanese pilots would encounter an enemy whose engines never seemed to stop. That realization would define the next phase of the war, and it would be felt most sharply in the cockpit. Angle 1, pilot training. Hours that changed the sky. By 1943, the difference between American and Japanese pilots was no longer just skill. It was endurance, measured in hours burned and fuel consumed. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators were among the most thoroughly trained in the world. Many logged more than 700 flight hours before entering combat. Precision, discipline, and confidence defined their early successes. But this level of training depended on abundant fuel, and once shortages set in, it vanished quickly. Training hours were slashed. Advanced maneuvers were reduced or eliminated. New pilots were rushed forward with barely a fraction of their predecessors' experience. By late 1944, some Japanese pilots entered combat with less than 100 flight hours. Many of them spent flying straight-line navigation rather than combat drills. Across the Pacific, the opposite was happening. American pilot training expanded aggressively. Fuel consumption was not treated as a liability, but as an investment. U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces pilots routinely logged 300 to 400 hours before combat assignment, with continuous refresher training afterward. Carrier pilots practiced landings repeatedly, burning thousands of gallons to perfect muscle memory. Japanese pilots noticed the difference in the air. American pilots flew longer engagements. They disengaged, climbed, and returned. They chased when fuel allowed. Japanese pilots often broke off not because of damage, but because their gauges demanded it. This imbalance quietly reshaped air combat, long before decisive battles were fought. Angle 2, operational tempo, sorties without pause. Fuel does not just train pilots. It sets the rhythm of war. American air operations increased steadily from 1942 onward. Carriers launched dawn strikes, recovered aircraft, refueled, and launched again. Land-based fighters flew patrols that stretched across entire regions. Bombers conducted missions that lasted hours, sometimes returned to fly again the next day. Japanese forces struggled to match this pace. Each sortie was weighed against fuel reserves. Missions were shortened, patrols reduced. Aircraft sat idle on runways, not from lack of pilot or planes, but from lack of fuel. Japanese after-action reports repeatedly noted American persistence. Attacks came in waves. When one group withdrew, another appeared. This was not perceived as bravery alone. It was seen as material dominance made visible. Angle 3, psychological impact, the empty needle. For Japanese pilots, fuel shortages became personal. The fuel gauge became an enemy as real as any American fighter. Pilots calculated return distances constantly. Aggressive maneuvers were avoided. Chases were abandoned. Combat decisions were shaped by mathematics rather than instinct. American pilots flew differently. They pressed attacks longer. They loitered. They escorted bombers across distances Japanese pilots had once believed impossible. Over time, this disparity wore down morale. Japanese pilots began to expect that Americans would return again and again. The sky no longer felt contested. It felt occupied. And as these impressions accumulated, commanders on both sides began to understand that the air war was being decided long before the first shot of the next major battle. Those battles were coming soon. Angle 4, logistics, the machinery behind the endless flights. What Japanese pilots saw in the sky was the surface expression of a vast system operating far beyond their reach. American logistics transformed fuel into a forward weapon. Oil did not move in single vulnerable streams. It moved in layers. Tankers fed depots. Depots fed fleets. Fleets fed airfields. Every link was redundant. If one route failed, another compensated. In the Central Pacific, newly seized islands were converted into logistical hubs with astonishing speed. Steel-fueled tanks were assembled in pieces and bolted together on coral ground. Flexible pipelines ran directly from beaches to airstrips. Tankers anchored offshore, pumping aviation gasoline straight into storage without delay. Aircraft could land, refuel, and launch again within minutes. Japanese reconnaissance pilots observed these changes with disbelief. Where there had once been empty atolls, now stood fully functioning air bases supporting continuous operations. These were not temporary camps. They were permanent machines designed to sustain flight indefinitely. Fuel, in the American system, was never allowed to become visible to the pilot as concern. Angle 5, enemy intelligence, misjudging the American limit. Japanese intelligence struggled to interpret what it was seeing. Early war assessments assumed that American operations would slow as distances increased. Fuel consumption models suggested natural limits, yet these limits never appeared. American air activity intensified the farther west it moved. Reports from pilots and observers described aircraft returning from missions thought impossible. Fighters escorting bombers across open ocean. Carriers remaining on station longer than expected. None of this aligned with Japanese pre-war assumptions. The conclusion, reluctantly reached, was unsettling. The Americans were not merely well supplied. They were organized around abundance. By contrast, Japanese planners were forced into constant compromise. Fuel earmarked for training was diverted to operations. Fuel for operations was hoarded for decisive moments that rarely arrived. Every decision narrowed future options. Angle 6, leadership. Two ways of thinking about fuel. At the leadership level, the contrast was stark. American planners treated fuel as a strategic certainty. They planned operations assuming full availability, then built systems to guarantee it. The question was not can we afford this flight, but how many more can we fly? Japanese leaders operated under permanent constraint. Admirals and generals debated how long fuel reserves could sustain the war. Tactical brilliance could not overcome empty tanks. Even victory at sea meant little if fuel was burned faster than it could be replaced. By late 1943, this difference in thinking had hardened into reality. One side planned expansion, the other planned conservation. The consequences of that divergence would soon become unmistakable in the skies over the Marianas and the Philippines, where fuel abundance and fuel scarcity would collide directly and irreversibly. June 1944, the Central Pacific becomes a focal point of the air war. The American invasion of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, was not just a territorial advance. It was a logistical declaration. From these islands, U.S. bombers could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time. And behind the invasion force came fuel, vast quantities of it. As American carriers assembled east of the Marianas, their flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. They launched in carefully timed waves, recovered, refueled, and launched again. Below deck, aviation gasoline flowed steadily through armored piping, insulated from battle damage, protected by years of hard-learned design. Japanese naval aviation prepared to respond, but the conditions were no longer equal. Many Japanese pilots assigned to the defense of the Marianas were inexperienced. Training hours had been cut repeatedly. Fuel shortages meant fewer practice flights. Combat would be their first real test. On June 19, 1944, American radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft at long range. U.S. fighters launched early, climbing with full fuel loads. They had the freedom to maneuver, to chase, to engage at their advantage. Japanese pilots, flying long distances from distant bases, arrived with limited fuel reserves. Engagement time was short. Retreat was mandatory, not optional. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots described wave after wave of Japanese aircraft arriving in disorganized formations. Many were shot down before reaching bombing range. Others pressed attacks and then vanished, either destroyed or forced to turn back with empty tanks. Throughout the day, American carriers continued to operate at full tempo. Aircraft landed, refueled, rearmed, and returned to the air. There was no pause, no visible strain. Japanese pilots, watching their fuel gauges sink while American fighters stayed aloft, began to understand the imbalance fully. This was not simply superior aircraft or tactics. It was the ability to remain in the fight indefinitely. By nightfall, Japanese naval aviation had been shattered. Hundreds of aircraft were lost. Even more devastating was the loss of trained pilots, an asset Japan could no longer replace. Yet the realization did not end there. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated itself across the Western Pacific. Wherever American forces advanced, fuel followed. Wherever Japanese pilots fought, fuel dictated their limits. And as the war moved toward the Philippines, the consequences of this imbalance would become impossible to ignore. By the autumn of 1944, the air war over the Pacific had entered a new phase, one defined not by surprise, but by inevitability. The American return to the Philippines forced Japanese air units into desperate action. Bases in Luzon, Formosa, and the remaining islands of the inner defense line were ordered to commit everything they had left. Aircraft were dispersed, hidden, repaired with salvage parts. Fuel was pooled and rationed for what commanders hoped would be decisive strikes. But the fuel simply was not there. Japanese pilots launching from the Philippines flew with barely enough gasoline to reach their targets and attempt a return. Some missions were planned without a realistic expectation of coming back. Escort fighters could not remain with bombers for long. Combat engagements were brief and one-sided. Across the same skies, American aircraft operated with relentless consistency. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, U.S. carrier task forces remained at sea for extended periods, conducting continuous flight operations. Fighters patrolled vast areas. Bombers struck retreating ships again and again. Aircraft that took damage landed, were refueled, repaired, and returned to combat with astonishing speed. Japanese pilots watching this tempo were stunned, not by a single battle, but by the pattern. American planes never seemed to stop flying. Losses did not slow operations. Weather did not halt them. Distance no longer protected Japanese forces. Fuel scarcity now shaped Japanese strategy openly. Training programs collapsed almost entirely. Veteran pilots were held back to conserve fuel, then thrown into combat too late. New pilots were sent aloft with minimal preparation, some unable to perform basic combat maneuvers under pressure. Reports from Japanese air units repeatedly noted the same observation. American pilots appeared everywhere at all times, operating without visible restriction. One Japanese after-action report from late 1944 described American air activity as inexhaustible. This perception mattered. Air power is not only destructive, it is psychological. When one side believes the other can fly endlessly, resistance begins to erode before combat even starts. Japanese pilots increasingly understood that even successful attacks changed nothing. The Americans would return the next day, and the day after that. By late 1944, the realization was complete. The fuel imbalance was no longer a problem to be solved. It was a condition of the war itself. And as Japan's remaining air power withered under these constraints, the consequences would extend far beyond the cockpit, reshaping strategy, morale, and the final year of the war. By the beginning of 1945, the effects of fuel scarcity were visible across every branch of Japan's air forces. Airfields that once buzzed with activity now sat quiet for long stretches of the day. Aircraft remained parked not because of damage, but because there was nothing left to put in their tanks. Training units were dissolved or merged. Flight schools reduced instruction to the bare minimum. Taxiing, takeoff, straight-line flight, landing. Advanced combat training became a luxury Japan could no longer afford. The numbers told a stark story. Where Japanese naval aviators once trained for years, new pilots were now rushed through in a matter of months. Some entered combat with fewer than 80 hours in the air. Many had never fired their guns in practice. Their aircraft were often older models, flown cautiously to conserve fuel that could not be replaced. Veteran pilots felt the strain acutely. They were ordered to fly sparingly, then suddenly committed in critical moments. Even experienced airmen found themselves unable to maneuver freely in combat, knowing that an empty tank meant certain loss. The aggressive tactics that had once defined Japanese air combat faded away, replaced by brief engagements and rapid withdrawals. American air power, meanwhile, expanded without pause. New pilots arrived at the front fully trained, then continued flying daily. Replacement aircraft and fuel arrived together. Units that suffered losses were rebuilt quickly, their operational tempo unchanged. From the perspective of Japanese pilots, the Americans did not just replace what they lost, they multiplied it. This collapse in Japanese air capability was not the result of a single defeat. It was cumulative. Each month of fuel shortage narrowed options. Each cut in training produced weaker replacements. Each tanker sunk by American submarines tightened the grip. By early 1945, Japanese commanders faced a grim reality. Conventional air operations could no longer challenge American control of the skies. Fuel shortages had turned aircraft into static assets, present but powerless. It was under these conditions that Japan turned increasingly to desperate measures. Special attack units emerged not from fanaticism alone, but from logistical exhaustion. When pilots could not be trained for sustained combat, and fuel could not support prolonged operations, missions were planned that required only one flight. Yet even these measures could not alter the balance. American aircraft continued to fly, escorting bombers, striking shipping, supporting ground forces, without visible constraint. The contrast between abundance and scarcity had become absolute, and with the air war effectively decided, the consequences would ripple through every remaining campaign of the Pacific War. As 1945 progressed, the strategic significance of America's fuel supremacy became impossible to ignore. Where Japanese forces struggled to maintain even minimal sorties, U.S. air power expanded relentlessly. The logistics that supplied endless waves of aircraft now dictated the pace of the war itself. Carriers and land-based airfields operated in perfect coordination. Refueling systems, both at sea and on islands, ensured that every aircraft could fly multiple sorties per day. Fuel tanks on captured islands became permanent hubs, supporting both combat and training operations simultaneously. Every replenished aircraft reinforced the impression that American forces could strike continuously, unhindered by distance or supply. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945 exemplified this imbalance. U.S. Marines advanced under the cover of air superiority that Japanese pilots could no longer contest. Fighters and bombers launched from nearby bases repeatedly, while Japan's limited aviation units were forced into short-range sorties, constrained by dwindling fuel reserves. For every Japanese aircraft in the sky, there were 5 American planes maintaining pressure, reconnaissance, and offensive operations. Even the most experienced Japanese commanders recognized that fuel scarcity had become a decisive weapon, one that could not be countered with skill or bravery alone. Battles that might have been closely contested earlier in the war were now overwhelmingly one-sided. By the time Okinawa fell, the pattern was clear. Wherever Americans could project air power, the logistical system behind it guaranteed dominance. Fuel had effectively become a silent instrument of warfare, invisible to the casual observer, yet felt in every cockpit, every strategy session, and every mission report. The Japanese Air Force, once the most feared in the Pacific, had been reduced not solely by losses in combat, but by the relentless, sustained pressure enabled by America's industrial and logistical mastery. This structural advantage allowed U.S. forces to plan operations with confidence, knowing that aircraft would always be available. The war's tempo, previously unpredictable, was now set by American production and supply. When the last carrier left a forward base fully stocked, Japanese pilots could only watch, powerless to contest the skies they once dominated. The stage was set for final months of the Pacific War, where the outcome of battles would increasingly reflect not individual heroics, but the invisible power of fuel, logistics, and industrial scale. By the end of World War II, the story of fuel in the Pacific had become as decisive as any battle or strategy. It was a resource invisible to the casual observer, yet it shaped every dogfight, every bombing run, and every campaign. Japanese pilots had once ruled the skies with skill and courage, but even skill could not overcome the silent, inexhaustible supply that fueled American aircraft day after day. America's ability to convert industrial capacity into operational endurance revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Dominance is not achieved solely through weapons or tactics, but through systems that sustain them. Fuel became a weapon in itself, strategic, relentless, and unseen, allowing planes to strike repeatedly, carriers to operate indefinitely, and pilots to train without pause. Where Japanese aviators encountered scarcity, American pilots encountered abundance. Where one side hesitated, the other advanced without restraint. This imbalance reshaped the psychology of combat. Morale faltered not just because of losses, but because the enemy seemed inexhaustible. It demonstrated that warfare is as much about what happens behind the front lines, in factories, refineries, and supply depots, as what occurs in the air or on the ground. In the end, the Pacific War offers a lesson far beyond any single engagement. Logistical foresight and industrial planning can outlast courage and innovation when resources are constrained. Fuel, the silent lifeblood of war, proved decisive, not with flash of glory, but with persistent, unyielding presence. It enabled victory, defined strategy, and altered the course of history, reminding future generations that sometimes the most powerful weapon is one you never see coming.